But over the months since then, all of those initial American assumptions about how the war would negatively affect China have proven to have been disastrously wrong. The meme of China doing nothing and winning right now does have some element of truth behind it. But that meme betrays the fact that China is actually doing a lot behind the scenes to counter whatever America is throwing at it. It's been well understood in China for decades now that one of the country's greatest vulnerabilities is its lack of oil within their own borders. China still to this day relies on imports from abroad to meet about 70% of its total oil consumption, about half of which also still comes from around the Persian Gulf. Thus, if you eliminate China's oil imports from the Persian Gulf, you eliminate about 35% of the source of China's total oil consumption, which is exactly the scenario that happened when Iran enforced a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the war. One would logically assume that the sudden and immediate loss of roughly 35% of China's usual oil supply would have tripled the Chinese.
大家好，这里是华人看世界 CNView 频道。美国和以色列在中东对伊朗发动战争，原本是想切断中国的重要能源来源，打击中国的经济与国际影响力。然而几个月过去，战局的发展却完全出乎华盛顿预料。伊朗封锁霍尔木兹海峡，全球油价飙升。中国真的会因此陷入困境吗？答案可能恰恰相反。凭借多年建设的战略石油储备、多元化进口渠道以及煤炭、核能和可再生能源体系，中国不仅扛住了能源冲击，甚至还能通过减少采购影响全球油价。与此同时，中国的电动汽车、太阳能板和电池产业获得了前所未有的关注。人民币结算和替代美国金融体系的力量也在加速扩张。更意外的是，美国在中东的军事行动正在消耗自身实力，牵动盟友关系，并让越来越多国家重新评估中美两国的可靠性。这场战争究竟是谁赢了？中国又是如何在看似没有直接参战的情况下，逐步掌握更多筹码？接下来，我们就来拆解这场战争背后真正改变世界格局的连锁反应。
The United States and Israel initiated a major war in the Middle East against Iran. And the biggest winner of this war isn't going to be any of them. It's going to be China instead. Back at the end of February, when the US and Israel decided to launch this war, they did so with the expectation that the exact opposite outcome would follow, with China becoming severely weakened and humbled. If the staunchly anti-Western regime in Iran were toppled by the war, then China would lose a major source of its discounted oil. Because of the crippling financial sanctions placed on Iran by the West, Iran has always had very few countries actually willing to purchase their oil at scale other than China, which has enabled China to buy up Iranian oil at a steep discount off of its usual market value. Roughly 13% of all of China's oil imports were likely coming cheaply from Iran immediately before the war began. And so, cutting that supply off would have placed even further pressure on China following the US abduction of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela that took place just a few weeks beforehand. Similar to Iran, crippling Western financial sanctions placed on Maduro's regime in Venezuela had meant that there were very few countries willing to purchase Venezuelan oil other than China, which meant that China could apply leverage on Venezuela to purchase their oil for a steep discount. Roughly 3% of China's total oil imports were similarly coming cheaply from Venezuela, which the US was able to largely sever and redirect to itself after they seized Maduro and changed the country's leadership through a rapid military raid. Were the US to manage to topple the Iranian regime and reroute their oil exports as well, China would have become severed from two of its largest sources of cheap discounted oil, representing about 16% of its usual total imports that would have had to have been replaced from somewhere else. And even better, from Washington's perspective, China would have become exposed as a weak bystander to global events that was unable or unwilling to defend friendly regimes in both Venezuela and Iran alike. The US would be able to clearly display that its superpower strength still remained the dominant force in the world, while China would be shown as a fair-weather friend and a weaker power that could not be relied upon to help resist Washington. Or so Washington's theory of victory went when they decided to start the war. But over the months since then, all of those initial American assumptions about how the war would negatively affect China have proven to have been disastrously wrong. The meme of China doing nothing and winning right now does have some element of truth behind it. But that meme betrays the fact that China is actually doing a lot behind the scenes to counter whatever America is throwing at it. It's been well understood in China for decades now that one of the country's greatest vulnerabilities is its lack of oil within their own borders. China still to this day relies on imports from abroad to meet about 70% of its total oil consumption, about half of which also still comes from around the Persian Gulf. Thus, if you eliminate China's oil imports from the Persian Gulf, you eliminate about 35% of the source of China's total oil consumption, which is exactly the scenario that happened when Iran enforced a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the war. One would logically assume that the sudden and immediate loss of roughly 35% of China's usual oil supply would have tripled the Chinese economy. But that didn't actually ever happen, because China has spent decades diligently preparing for a scenario that is almost exactly identical to this. China has always been very paranoid about what it calls its Malacca dilemma, the fact that the overwhelming majority of its critical oil imports flow through the narrow Strait of Malacca that, during wartime, could become easily blockaded by the US Navy. Defending and countering against that Malacca dilemma has been at the core of Chinese foreign policy for decades now. But little did Beijing expect that their preparations for that would also end up coming in handy for when Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz as well. To prepare for a possible American blockade of their seaborne oil imports during a war over Taiwan, China has pursued a multi-pronged strategy of diversifying their sources of oil imports, building up their stockpiles of oil, and destroying their own domestic demand for oil. Let's go through these points one by one. First, China has spent decades quietly building up what has become the world's largest national strategic reserve of oil. On paper, China's strategic reserve of oil might appear to be lower than America's. By December of 2025, according to the Energy Information Administration, or EIA, the Chinese government officially held 359 million barrels of oil in reserve, while the US government officially held 413 million barrels in reserve. However, most of the commercial inventories of oil in China that are technically outside of the official strategic reserve are also held by Chinese state-owned oil companies, which blurs the line between the country's government-held and commercial-held reserves. While in the US, the country's commercially held inventories of oil are fully separate from the government's reserves. Thus, by the end of 2025, the Chinese government had effectively established a strategic reserve of oil that was more than 3 times the size of America's. It was buoyed by massive purchases of oil by the Chinese throughout 2025 that filled up their stockpiles when the price of oil was comparatively lower. And it was enough to fully last 100% of China's usual oil consumption for more than 100 days, without any additional imports or societal changes at all. By comparison, the US Strategic Reserve only held enough at the start of 2026 to fully provide for 100% of America's usual oil consumption for a mere 20 days, 1/5 as long as China's. In addition to that, China's worked hard over the past several years to radically diversify the sources of oil they import to reduce their dependencies on any single given geographic location. While about half of China's oil imports come from around the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, that ratio was much lower for China than just about every other nation in East Asia. Japan relied on about 93% of its oil imports from the Persian Gulf. South Korea relied on the region for about 70% of theirs, while Taiwan relied on it for about 58% of theirs. So, comparatively to the rest of the major economies of East Asia, China was relatively less exposed to disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, and they had a much larger stockpile of oil held in reserve to get them through any crisis as well. And on top of those two factors, China has also spent years crafting a national energy strategy to reduce their economic dependence on oil as a resource altogether as well, which ironically has made heavy use of both coal and renewable technologies alike. While China doesn't really have a lot of oil within their own borders, they do have a ton of coal. Like to the point where China has the 3rd largest proven reserves of coal in the world, just behind Russia. Thus, China still relies on its own huge domestic reserves of coal that can't be blockaded from abroad to provide for a significant amount of their own energy and electricity demand. Roughly 56% of China's total energy supply still comes from burning coal, compared to only 18% from oil and just 9% from natural gas. And China's electricity production is even more lopsided in coal's favor, with 60% of the nation's electricity generated through coal compared to only 3% from oil and gas combined. And most of the rest comes through China's massive investments into renewable and nuclear energy technologies. China installed almost half of the entire world's solar and wind energy capacity in 2024. Solar and wind accounted for 22% of China's total energy needs in 2022, and they plan to increase that share even further to 30% by 2030. At the same time, China is doubling down on their nuclear energy as well. In 2024, 4.5% of China's electricity came from nuclear power, but they're planning on increasing that share up to 10% by 2035. Overall, wind, solar, and nuclear energy contributed to more than 22% of China's electricity generation in 2024. About another 13% came from hydropower, and another 60% came from coal, meaning that China was already almost completely independent from oil and gas to keep their electricity going. By comparison, South Korea still relies on imported oil and gas to power 29% of their own electricity, Japan for 34% of theirs, and Taiwan for a whopping 44% of theirs. In most economies, rising oil prices most usually affects consumers at the fuel pump when they go to fill up their cars with gasoline. But since the early 2000s, in order to reduce their dependence on foreign oil even further and to shield more of their population from oil supply crunches, China has pursued a relentless strategy of adopting as many EVs in the country as possible. By 2024, roughly 11% of all the passenger vehicles on the road in China were EVs. A bit behind countries like Denmark and Sweden, but well ahead of any of their regional rivals like South Korea and the United States, with only a 3% share of EVs on their roads, or Japan with just a 1% share of EVs on their roads. All of this combined, from China's massive stockpiles of oil to its almost zero use of oil for electricity generation, and to its high adoption rate of EVs on the road, meant that China was well prepared to weather through a massive oil supply shock that came when Iran began blocking the Strait of Hormuz. China was therefore able to cut back on their imported oil purchases during the war by approximately 4 million barrels per day, equivalent to double the oil consumption rate of Germany.
回看整场冲突，最值得注意的或许并不是哪一方在战场上摧毁了多少目标，而是谁能够承受冲击，谁又能把危机转化为新的筹码。美国和以色列原本设想通过打击伊朗、切断能源供应、重塑中东秩序，迫使中国陷入能源短缺、经济承压和外交被动。但事态的发展却呈现出完全不同的结果，战争拖得越久，霍尔木兹海峡越难以恢复通行，中国受到的直接打击反而越有限，而美国承担的战略成本却不断上升。这并不意味着中国没有损失，油价上涨、全球需求疲软、供应链受阻，都会影响中国这个制造业大国。真正关键在于，中国早已用几十年的时间为最坏的能源情景建立了缓冲。它一方面扩大石油储备，分散进口来源，降低对单一海域和单一国家的依赖；另一方面，通过煤炭、水电、核能和风光发电，减少石油在电力体系中的作用，再加上电动汽车的普及，让石油供应中断不至于立刻转化为全面的社会危机。这就是所谓战略准备的价值。很多准备在平时看起来成本高、见效慢，甚至会被认为没有必要。可是当危机真的发生时，决定国家能否保持稳定的，往往正是这些不够轰动却持续多年的基础工作。中国当年担心的是马六甲海峡可能被封锁，最终派上用场的却是应对霍尔木兹海峡关闭的能力。面对完全不同的对手和不同的地理环境，同一套能源安全思路依然发挥了作用。更重要的是，中国并没有在危机中被迫争抢每一桶石油，反而可以主动减少采购，把有限的储备留给更需要的领域。这样的选择不仅缓解了国内压力，也限制了全球油价继续飙升的空间。换句话说，中国的能源储备不只是保障自身的仓库，也在一定程度上变成了影响国际市场的工具。当中国何时恢复正常采购，以多大规模恢复采购，都可能影响全球价格和通胀预期时，能源就不再只是经济问题，而成为外交和战略博弈的一部分。这场战争还暴露出另一个变化，那就是能源转型已经不再只是环保议题。过去发展太阳能、电动汽车和电池常常被理解为应对气候变化的长期计划。但当一场战争就能让全球油价剧烈波动，让欧洲、亚洲和海湾国家同时感受到通胀与供应风险时，清洁能源就获得了更加现实的地缘政治意义。 谁掌握电池、光伏组件、风力设备和相关产业链，谁就可能在下一轮能源竞争中拥有更大的主动权。中国在这些领域的布局也因此获得了意外的外部推动力。美国和欧洲可以通过关税限制中国商品进入本土市场，但世界其他地区仍然需要价格更低、交付更快的能源设备。对许多发展中国家来说，选择太阳能板、电动汽车和储能电池，首先是经济计算，也是降低能源风险的现实选择。战争越是提醒各国不要把命运完全寄托在石油运输线上，绿色能源技术的需求就越可能继续增长。与此同时，金融结算体系的变化同样值得警惕。美元长期占据国际贸易和金融的核心位置，使美国能够监控资金流动，并通过银行体系和制裁工具影响其他国家。但当伊朗、俄罗斯等受到制裁的国家开始更多使用人民币、卢布或加密货币进行交易，当石油结算逐渐绕开美元和传统金融网络时，美国的制裁能力就会被削弱。人民币跨境支付系统规模仍然无法与 SWIFT 相提并论，但它的存在本身已经为一些国家提供了替代选项。国际体系的改变通常不是突然完成的，而是从一次次被迫寻找替代方案开始。当然，我们也不能简单的把这场战争概括成中国毫发无损，美国彻底失败，中国仍面临能源成本上升、外部需求下降和产业链波动等问题。美国也依然拥有强大的军事、金融和科技实力。真正发生变化的是双方优势的呈现方式。美国更擅长通过军事行动和金融制裁迅速施压，中国则更擅长把产业能力、能源储备、贸易网络和长期规划结合起来。前者可以在短期内制造巨大震动，后者则试图在漫长消耗中保持韧性。这也解释了为什么战争造成的声望损失可能比战场损失更加深远。当美国不断要求盟友承担战争成本，却又无法迅速解决危机时，欧洲担心通胀，海湾国家担心基础设施和经济安全。东亚盟友则开始重新评估美国究竟能否同时兑现所有安全承诺。盟友一旦产生疑问，国家之间的关系就会从单纯依赖转向更加复杂的平衡。对中国来说，这种裂缝提供了外交空间；对美国来说，这则是一次关于过度使用力量的警告。尤其是在台海问题上，中东战事会被反复解读，美国是否有足够的弹药、舰艇和战略耐心，同时应对中东与东亚两个方向的高强度冲突？美国的盟友是否愿意在每一次行动中跟随华盛顿？这些问题未必会立刻改变任何人的政策，却会影响各方对未来风险的判断。中国更希望通过经济联系、技术竞争和外交压力制造一种局势走向的必然感，而美国在中东的长期消耗，客观上可能削弱其威慑形象。所以本期内容真正带来的启示，并不是简单判断谁赢谁输，而是提醒我们，国际竞争早已超越单一战场，能源储备是实力，产业链是实力，支付系统是实力，盟友信任和国内社会的承受能力同样是实力。一个国家能否在危机中获益，往往取决于它是否提前为不确定性付出过成本。相反，一个看似强大的国家，如果频繁发动战争，却没有能力控制后果，那么军事优势也可能逐渐转化为战略负担。拿破仑那句"不要打断正在犯错的敌人"之所以流传至今，是因为它揭示了大国博弈中最残酷的一面。有时最有效的行动并不是立刻出手，而是保持耐心，观察对手如何消耗资源、失去信誉，并把更多空间留给自己。中国是否会成为这场战争的最大赢家？最终还要看局势如何演变，但至少可以确定，战争原本用来施压中国，却让能源安全、绿色技术、人民币结算和外交影响力获得了新的推动力。接下来，真正决定中美竞争走向的，可能不再是谁能发动更大的军事行动，而是谁能建设更稳定的经济体系，掌握更关键的技术，并让更多国家相信自己值得成为长期合作对象。欢迎大家在评论区谈谈，你认为这场冲突最大的赢家是谁？中国的能源和产业布局能否继续抵御未来的外部冲击？也欢迎关注后续内容，继续一起观察世界格局的变化。最后别忘了点赞订阅，观看更多精彩视频。